Hello and welcome to the Motorway Man, and welcome to a new episode where I'll be looking at the origins, peak and sudden collapse of probably the most famous former service station operator that there is. So join me in today's show where I'll be looking at the rise and fall of Granada. So let's get into it then. So Granada Services was founded in 1962, so we'll be starting around there. So back in the 1960s, service stations and motorways were a new thing, and every company wanted to get involved. Granada was no exception. They bid for their first service station in 1963, and it was opened a year later in 1964. Their very first service station was Toddington, and it acted as their very first headquarters, which is where they were based for the remainder of their operation. Now, later in the 1960s, Granada opened more service stations and moved away from the old luxurious approach to service stations to a more cheaper service. Now, this cheap way of running things allowed for high profits, and Granada began to make more money and build more service stations. This continued into the 1970s, and Granada's first major expansion came from their purchase of Taverner in 1973. Taverner were a small service station chain who were struggling to find their feet and break into the market. Taverner started in 1970 and by 1973 had 5 service stations, all of which were purchased by Granada for £2 million, which back then was quite a lot of money, and the deal included the most futuristic service station on the motorway, Washington. A service station we can learn more about in my service station tour on Sunday. Anyway, back to Granada. So following their purchase of Taverner in 1973, Granada began to kit them out in their own style, cheap and cheerful, and it was now in the 1970s and then the 1980s when the Granada Forte competition really started to heat up. Granada and Forte were two of the biggest service station operators at the time and had very contrasting ways of operating. Forte had fewer service stations, but they were always more high quality, and Granada had a lot more, but they were frequently less well kept and in need of renovation and were often smaller. Forte and Granada fought throughout the 80s over customers, with Granada always opening new service stations to try and gain a monopoly. Forte attempted to do the same, and they even famously bought out Little Chef so no other operator could use it. They did this in the 1980s. And the rivalry continued, and as an attempt to gain customers from Forte, Granada in 1986 began their own budget hotel chain called the Granada Lodge, and it was found on over 19 service stations at one point. This new hotel chain was doing well, as was Granada, as they were now able to open more service stations and became the preferred choice of operator. Forte even changed their name to Welcome Break at one point, and yet another attempt to try and outdo Granada in 1988. Now Welcome Break was so popular, Granada had to do something to stay on top, and Granada's idea, build more service stations, and if you couldn't build them, of course, quick enough, then you had to buy them. Now Granada purchased Pavilion for $125 million in 1992, a deal including 8 new service stations, so that's really good. And by 1995, Forte's Welcome Break could no longer keep up, and Granada bought their biggest competition for $500 million. The deal included Welcome Break, Little Chef, and a French service station chain, Côte France, and Forte, so it was a really good, intelligent buy. Granada owned not just 80% of the UK market, but a good chunk of the European market now as well. But unfortunately, Granada got a bit too big, and it was hard to manage at this time, so they sold some small sites to a new operator first, who were later purchased by roadside in 2011. Granada also sold their French service stations, Côte France, to an Italian operator, and it was all this buying and selling that made the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, now called the Competition Commission, to get involved. They said that Granada was being unfair and had taken away all competition, so the Commission ruled that Granada had to sell some service stations to make things competitive and fair once again. Granada sold all their Welcome Breaks for $476 million and also lost many A-road services as well. unfortunately, and in 1988 Granada had lost over 25% of all of their service stations, so now we are starting to see the fall of Granada. And in one last attempt to re-establish themselves, Granada began a new way of building service areas. Their new approach was called Village at the Roadside, and the plan was being that the service stations would be more like shopping centres, and more people would want to stop there. Now I think that's quite a good idea. However, it was only ever implemented into 2 service stations, Donington Park and Doncaster North. Service station tours of those service stations coming into the future. Now, to start building new types of service stations, you do need a lot of investment, and with Granada's apparent decline, investors didn't really want to invest in a new way of building, so by 2001, Granada had to keep selling their service stations in order to fund their future developments, and by 2001 they had sold 25% of all of their service stations, and were really struggling with their new Village at the Roadside concept we discussed earlier. So unfortunately, in May 2001, Granada ended for financial reasons, therefore selling their remaining sites to another rich company, and the new owners established Moto, and we can learn a full history of Moto in my Moto Service Station Operators episode. But anyway, yes, by May 2001, it was all over. The once mighty Granada had fallen and was replaced by Moto. So how did the once super popular Granada, who owns 80% of all UK service stations, disappear within weeks? Well, it would seem that they just owned too much, because an operator can only successfully operate so many service stations. Granada operated over 50, but with the infrastructure to only operate 20, so I believe that Granada's rise, as great and as quick as it was, happened way too quickly. So I would conclude and say that the rise of Granada was due to their desire to constantly expand. This led to lots of service stations and a general good growth for the business. And I would say that the fall of Granada was because they just didn't have the infrastructure in place to operate that many service stations, because they expanded way too quickly. So unfortunately, Granada must join the list of extinct operators, and if this video does well, then I may look at the rise and fall of other extinct operators. So if you want me to make this a series, make sure you give the video a thumbs up, and we might be looking at the rise and fall of other operators in the future. So anyway, thanks for watching. I do appreciate your time, and by the way, make sure you tune in this Wednesday, which is the 12th of July, because I've got a great service station operators special on Extra, which is my favourite service station operator, so it's really nice to get to their episode. And also, make sure you tune in this Sunday to check out a service station tour of Washington services. By the way, did you know that's the most northern service station in all of England? How interesting. But anyway, thank you for watching. I do appreciate your time. I would also really appreciate it if you subscribed, because I'm so close to 100 subscribers. So if you could help me get there, that'd be great. Thank you and goodbye.